My name is Husna-Tara Prakash, and I am married into the fourth generation of the Chaiwala family in India that has an infectious love for all things to do with tea. Growing up, I had many boarding school friends that lived on tea estates with funny names like Salona, Damdim, and Dumduma, and they led intriguing lifestyles on these mysterious estates. Today, I am immersed in this wonderful world of tea and hospitality, and our Glenburn tea journey has allowed us to welcome thousands of visitors from all around the world to our boutique hotel on our 1,600-acre tea estate in the Indian Himalayas, and also to transport many more to our other family estate, Khungia in Assam, through the endless cups of tea that they all drink from the comfort of their homes. Through our virtual booth, Glenburn Tea Direct, also known as Glenburn Fine Teas, in this fantastic virtual show organized by tea stalwarts Babette and Nicole, with support from dear friends like Dan Robertson and many others, we invite you to explore the world of Indian tea. And today I will take you through the story of how tea came to India and why it is today not only our national drink, but the most popular drink in the world after water. 25,000 cups of tea are drunk every second, and 2.16 billion cups of tea are drunk per day. This is how it all began. There is no doubt that tea originated in China. An Emperor Shen Nung was sitting under the shade of a tree when a light breeze caused a few leaves to fall into his cup of boiling water. They mixed with the water and gave it a delicate color and perfume. The emperor tasted it and found it delicious. The tree was a wild tea plant, and this is how tea was born. Legends in India and Japan, however, talk about Prince Bodhidharma, who set out to preach the teachings of Lord Buddha in China. He vowed to never sleep during the 9 years of his journey, but towards the end of the third year, he was overcome by drowsiness, was about to fall asleep when he, by chance, plucked a few leaves from a wild tea plant and began to chew upon them. The stimulating qualities of tea immediately woke him up, and he found the strength to stay awake for the remaining 6 years of his mission by chewing these tea leaves. By the 8th century, the Tang dynasty had made tea the undisputed national drink, first in Chinese court circles, but then it spread to all sections of society. Lots of tea plantations were established and production methods improved. They learned how to steam and then bake the tea, which is still a fundamental process of green tea. Much has been written about the extent the Chinese went to make the drinking and preparing of tea a real art and something associated with beauty and poetry. Lu Yu was one of the most famous tea masters of the 8th century, and he was the first to write a book about tea. Lu Yu documents the societal pressures that made tea making quite complicated. It had to be boiled in the right water, heated over the right charcoal, brewed in the right utensils, and served in the right cups. And any error in this led to a loss of face. So it was very much a ceremony at this time. The Sung dynasty in the 12th century changed the method of serving tea from boiling the leaves with the tea to boiling the water first, and then adding the water to the powdered tea, leaving it to brew much as we do today. Before serving the brewed tea into bowls, it was whisked. This new method of serving tea, powdered and then whisked, became the basis of the famous Japanese tea ceremony. Tea spread to Japan by Japanese Zen scholars, and there was a strong association with tea being able to keep sleep at bay, which was important for meditation. The tea bushes in Japanese tea gardens were also not flat, but gently curved into uniform arches, giving them a Zen-like beauty. They mainly produce green tea, and much of it is greener than in other countries because they sometimes cover the plants with mats for 3 weeks before the harvest to increase the amount of green chlorophyll in the bud. During the reign of the Ming dynasty, Chinese tea found its way to the West. Ceramic was also developed for domestic use, and the Mings used to drink tea out of fine porcelain rather than stoneware, which led to the invention of the teapot. Huge quantities of fine porcelain were shipped to the West along with tea, and it became fashionable to link the two together. At first it was expensive, but then they started using porcelain to line the bottom of ships, as wooden ships always leak, and this would cause the tea to rot. So it became very cheap to ship porcelain, and soon it was always used as a platform for expensive cargoes of silk and tea. So tea came to Europe rather late, many centuries after it had become a common drink for the Chinese, and by this time certain norms had already been established. Tea was loose leaf onto which the boiling water was poured, it was allowed to steep, and it was drunk in handleless cups made of porcelain, and it was no longer whisked. The Ming dynasty had also introduced the concept of flavored teas using flowers and scented oils of lotus, orange, gardenia, and especially jasmine. And they had also started the production of black tea. The first teas imported to the West were green, but soon black teas took over and eventually came to dominate Western taste. The first country to discover tea in Europe were the Dutch, and they became the first premier tea drinkers in Europe. But it slowly spread through to France, and Louis VIII had a teapot of pure gold in the 1650s. But the British were very slow to discover tea. So tea finally made its way to England in the year 1662 when Catherine Braganza of Portugal married King Charles II and, as part of her dowry, carried a chest of tea. She also carried the fork, which had never been seen in England before, and two political gifts, Tangier in Africa and the very important port of Bombay in India. From the court of Charles II, it rippled into fashionable society first as a drink of the wealthy and only later into middle-class society. But by the 1700s, the rise in demand for tea was phenomenal. There's no real explanation as to why the British drank so much tea and with so much more zeal than any other major Western country. Countries like France, where tea had been very fashionable, soon switched back to coffee and wine. There were huge patterns of oversupply and then undersupply, and taxes played a very big role. First, liquid tea was taxed, and then the tax was shifted to the leaf form. During the 18th century, Anna, the Duchess of Bedford, introduced what today has become known as afternoon tea, after experiencing that sinking feeling between lunch and late supper. It was so enjoyable that she soon started inviting her friends over, and then it was copied by other hostesses, and serving tea at afternoon tea parties became a very common event. Tea was also drunk as a medicine, and then as a stimulant, as people felt it made them active and lively. It drove off sleep, and every drinker of tea could not be but sensible. Soon ships were being designed to carry teas as fast as they could from China to England to meet the rising demand that the English population had. These famous clipper ships held races across the world, with ship designing improving as the popularity of tea grew and grew. As imports to Britain rose, the general public had two big problems. First of all, there was a complete monopoly by the East India Company, and the second issue was the extremely high duties that the government imposed upon tea. It was simply too expensive. So they had to resort to methods like tea adulteration to try and make it more affordable. They used the leaves of other trees, they added coloring to help it pass off as real tea, they used chemicals like Prussian blue, copper carbonate, and even sheep's dung, which was actually the least harmful of all of these. And these colors were mainly used to imitate green tea, which was more drunk at that time, but gradually the shift moved towards black tea as well. Tea smuggling was also very common because it was so expensive and the demand was so high by the general population that tea smuggling was completely acceptable at the time. The illegal tea being smuggled into England didn't help the government with their legal tea, so they had to send a lot of it off to their colonies, like America, and this led to one of the most famous protests in colonial America in 1773. A group of Americans jumped onto a British ship that contained an expensive cargo of tea, and they threw it into the harbor, and this came to be known as the Boston Tea Party, and was one of the triggers that led to American independence. In 1783, William Pitt, the Prime Minister of England, knew that he had to do something about the high taxes. So he dropped the tax from 119% down to 12.5%. In place of this tea tax, he introduced something called window tax, which might have been the origin of the phrase daylight robbery. And if you drive around the English countryside, you'll often see houses with bricked up windows, because if you had 10 windows in your house, you paid a higher tax than if you had only 2. This also immediately stopped the smuggling of tea, as the government was able to tax the tea at a reasonable rate, and they benefited from this very, very quickly. The British and the Chinese had a complicated relationship. The British were a great trading nation and were very good at exchanging goods that they manufactured for goods that they wanted. However, the problem was that the Chinese desired very little from them and only wanted to be paid in silver. And life was going to be very difficult for the British, as giving the Chinese so much silver might debase the British currency. So for a while they produced cotton in India, which they sold for silver and used the silver for tea, but the Chinese need for cotton was nothing compared to the British need for tea. Luckily, they found one other commodity that the Chinese were increasingly demanding. Opium is the dried juice of the unripe seed capsules of the opium poppy. Originating in Southwest Asia, known to the Greeks and the Romans, it was probably brought to India by the Arabs, and by the 16th century it was being extensively cultivated by the British in India. Initially, it was used as a medicine, but with the arrival of tobacco in 1620, its use was transformed, and soon it was the most favored drug in China. By 1830, China was importing over 2.5 million pounds of Indian opium a year, which was more than enough to cover the amount of tea required back home in England. The emperor tried to ban opium smoking in China when he realized the extent of the drug problem, and this led to smuggling, wars, bribes, and the involvement of nations as far as America and Mexico. There were huge repercussions of these opium for tea wars, and it led to the destabilization of the Chinese regime. The central government lost huge areas of their country to pirates and robbers. Huge tracts of good land for crops were swapped for the cultivation of opium within China, which led to food shortages. And the foreigners who caused all this were labeled as evil and hated. Hong Kong was also permanently lost to the British. By the beginning of the 19th century, with all the problems with Chinese trade, the British finally realized that they had to find a way of cultivating their own tea. Now, by this time, the East India Company had become quite a force in India. They had initially robbed the Spanish, copied the Dutch banking system, defeated the French in India, and were going through the process of slowly plundering the Indians in order to build their empire. The British Empire was vast, it was strong, and it was rich, and they had to find a way of supplying tea back to England. And this is where the story of tea comes to India. They hired a spy, a botanist called Robert Fortune, and sent him into China in search of the secret formula for the world's favorite drink. Now, at this time, the British didn't even realize that black tea and green tea came from the same plant. They thought that they grew in different parts of China. So when Robert Fortune visited China, they knew very little about this mysterious tea plant. And he had to disguise himself as a Chinese mandarin and hire local people to help him with his mission. But eventually he was able to successfully smuggle 20,000 tea plants from China to India. And they survived the long journey over many months across the sea by using something known as a Wardian case, which is shown in this slide. The glass allowed sunlight to enter the case, and it was sealed so that the moisture in the soil was maintained, and the plants were able to photosynthesize and respire successfully and continue to grow until they reached their destination. But thinking about this today, it's a clear case of corporate espionage, and this is just how powerful and clever the British Empire was at this stage. Now, a couple of decades before this adventure into China, two brothers, Robert Bruce and his brother C.A. Bruce, had quite by accident come across a tea plant in Assam that was being cultivated quite unintentionally by the Singpo tribe. And with the help of a local Maniram Datta, they were able to extract this plant from the tribe, and they sent it to Calcutta for testing, where they realized that it was actually a relative of the Chinese tea plant. Although at this time, the English had no idea how to grow tea in India, as they had no idea how it was grown or processed in China. The British had started experimenting with the viability of tea in India way back in the 1770s under Warren Hastings, the first Governor General of the East India Company. And in 1823, the tea plants in Assam had been discovered and identified. In 1834, after the Opium Wars, the British monopoly with Chinese tea ended. And by the middle of the century, Robert Fortune had visited China and smuggled those 20,000 tea plants out to India. But they found that the Chinese plants didn't grow very successfully in Assam, and even in the botanical gardens of Calcutta, they did not thrive as they'd expected them to. And it was actually the Assam plant that did far better in the hot, humid conditions of Calcutta and of Assam. So the China variety eventually was propagated in the highlands up in Darjeeling and the Kangra Valley, which was a slight altitude and helped the growth of this particular variety of tea. And the Assamese variety was planted out in the lower plains and the Brahmaputra Valley of Assam. By 1861, tea auctions in Calcutta were selling tea from Darjeeling, from Assam, Kumaon, and the Doon and Kangra valleys. And in 1875, tea was even established in South India when coffee was destroyed by leaf rust. So you can see from this map the areas where tea was planted out initially. In the northeast, you had it in Assam, and in the foothills of the Himalayas up in Darjeeling. Further west, the Kangra Valley and the Dehradun Valley was very successful in the planting of the Chinese variety. And then you also had tea growing in the lowlands between Darjeeling and the plains. This was an area called the Duars. And in the south, you had tea growing in the Nilgiri Hills and in the Travancore area. And here's another map that shows you the three broad tea growing regions of India. You have the foothills of the Himalayas, which are pretty much lowlands, the Brahmaputra Valley and the Duars region that I mentioned. And then the higher growing areas like Darjeeling, Kangra, and the Kumaon Hills. And then in South India, the states of Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and the Wayanad and Munnar areas too. One of the big differences between the tea that grows in the northern part of India and the southern part of India is the effect of daylight hours and latitude. Tea will only grow if it has a certain number of daylight hours. So naturally, when you're closer to the equator, you have much longer days, and therefore, even in the winter months of December and January, tea is able to grow. Whereas in the northern areas, in the winter, daylight hours are very limited. And so in Darjeeling, in Assam, and in the Kangra Valley, tea is only grown from March to November. And this is quite significant in the whole economics because it becomes a seasonal crop in the north, whereas in the south, it grows all year round. The people that established the plantations in Assam were very adventurous and quite hardy because this was a forested area where there was very little inhabitation. The Ahom tribes had lived here for many years, but there was no other real local population. So when the dense jungles were cleared, they had to brave the hazards from wild animals like elephants and tigers. And they also had to find a way of bringing labor into this region. And they did this by taking laborers from the regions of Bihar and Orissa and transporting them up by boat, up the Brahmaputra to this area to help them clear the land. And today, these are the people that form the workforce of the many tea estates in the region of Assam. These adventurers eventually built bungalows to live in that were raised on stilts to protect them from the wild animals. And these came to be known as Chang bungalows. And eventually, women came out and joined their husbands, and thriving communities of British planters came to live and love this part of the world. I'll now take you through some of the tea growing regions of India, starting with Assam, which is essentially a long flat river valley, which is surrounded by high mountains to the north and dense forests with many swamps, excessive rainfall, and extreme humidity, which makes it a very unpleasant climate to live in, but it's ideal for tea growth. You get the famous one-horned rhino, the mighty Brahmaputra that runs all the way from Tibet through Assam into Bangladesh, the famous Assamese silk, the fishermen and the rice paddies. And one of the unique teas that comes from this area is the Assam Golden Tips, which is picked during the second flush period in late June and is famous for its rich, spicy cup and delicious malty finish. Darjeeling is known as the Champagne of tea, and this region used to be part of the mountainous kingdom of Sikkim and was gifted to the British. And it eventually became a sanatorium for them where they could escape from the Calcutta heat. But it soon became a center for growing tea as the Chinese plants that Robert Fortune had sent to India thrived in this climate. The climate and scenery was also very conducive to good living, as well as the good teas, and they had less problem with the labor as the neighboring Nepalis were very happy to come across the border and work. And today, this is the majority ethnic community in Darjeeling, and these are the people who, in their third and fourth generations, are still living on the tea plantations and working to pick amazing tea. Of course, you look up to the third highest mountain in the world, Mount Kanchenjunga. The tea that grows in Darjeeling is actually certified with a geographical index because it is the terroir of this particular part of the world with its unique microclimate, its unique altitude that gives the tea its particular flavor. Which means that only tea from these 87 tea estates can be called Darjeeling tea. It's a beautiful region with rolling hills and lovely countryside, beautiful mountain views, and Buddhist prayer flags from the monasteries in neighboring Sikkim that have come into the area too. Local markets, villages, it's the perfect combination of a hill station and magical countryside. The interesting thing about Darjeeling tea is that it can be drunk in harmony with the season. And this is the famous Darjeeling First Flush, which is the most expensive tea of the year. It's made in the spring season, just when the bushes wake up after their winter sleep. And the same bush that produces the first flush in March will give you a second flush in June, and then move on to the monsoon flush in July, August, and September. And just before the end of the season, when it gets too cold in December, we get an autumn crescendo, which is a delicious tea that is made in November. And this is what really makes Darjeeling very, very unique as a tea. In South India, you have tea growing alongside coffee and spices. The Nilgiri Hills are also known as the Blue Mountains. And in Kerala, you have no orthodox leaf tea being produced, but only CTC production, which I will talk about in a little while. Tea also grows alongside rubber and spices such as cinnamon, pepper, cloves, cardamom, and even cocoa. Kerala tends to have a shortage of labor, so you have shear plucking that is used to harvest the leaves over here. And they have a heavy monsoon where they have very rapid growth, so it's very important for them to be able to harvest all the leaves during these heavy cropping months of June to August. Here are some pictures of the villages, the Catholic churches, Hindu temples, and an example of one of the teas that is made in this region. The Kangra Valley, which is more westwards compared to Assam and Darjeeling, is a beautiful area which produces beautiful teas. It's up at an elevation of 2,500 to 3,500 feet with reasonably small plantations compared to the ones in the east and in the south. And both black and green teas are produced, with the bushes being China hybrids mainly from the original tea bushes that came out with Robert Fortune. There's a great Buddhist influence in this area, with the town of Dharamshala being quite close by. And they also grow chamomile and other herbs such as lemongrass, tulsi, and mint to mix into the teas that come from the Kangra Valley. And this is an example of one of the spring orthodox leaf teas that comes from this region. Now, if tea today is considered the national drink of India, it's not the delicate orthodox teas that we've been looking at so far. it would definitely be the masala chai that you can drink in every street corner of the country from the north to the south. And now you even have fashionable chai lattes being served in American and European cafes in the West. But can you guess how long masala chai has been popular in India? I think you'd be surprised when I tell you of how recently it came to be drunk in India. So Indians didn't really start drinking tea before the 1920s and the 1930s. The British found it far more profitable to send all the tea they made in India back to England because the demand was so high. But between the First and Second World War, during the Great Depression, they found that they actually had too much tea. And so they decided that they had to find a way of selling it to the Indians themselves. And they started this very elaborate advertising campaign to show Indians that it was very fashionable to drink tea. And here are some of the posters that they came up with, linking it with all sorts of interesting lifestyle associations. But what they didn't realize was that the Indians didn't really want the fuss and the bother of the rituals of tea drinking like the English drank it. They wanted something stronger and more spicy and aromatic. So a housewife in India probably took the tea leaves that the British had tried to sell her and threw it into a pestle and mortar with some spices and some milk and lots of sugar and boiled it up like a really beautiful concoction that eventually became what we now call masala chai. And today it is this masala chai that is really the face of India. The tea at every street food stall is served with a big smile in beautiful earthen cups, which are sustainable and can be thrown away and disintegrate into the earth again. You have interactions where idle gossip and marriage matchmaking with endless debates take place on how to change the world over a cup of tea. In Bengal, it's called having an adda, but even in other parts of the world, business is conducted over cups of tea, politics, as I said, marriage and matchmaking. Tea really does drive India today. And I'll just refer to this book called Three Cups of Tea that has been slightly controversial in recent times. But the whole concept of the 3 cups of tea is something I find very powerful because the author said that when you sat down in a village with the community to drink a cup of tea, if you have the first cup with them, you're a stranger. But if you have the patience to sit and have the second cup of tea, you become a friend. And if you have the patience to sit with them and have that third cup of tea, you become part of the family. So tea drinking in the Indian subcontinent is something that traverses relationships, business, politics, and is very much a fabric of the social life that Indians lead. So this new type of tea that the Indians wanted to drink that was stronger and more brisk and pungent is known as the CTC style of tea. And it actually required the invention of a new type of machine to manufacture this, especially for this growing Indian market. So you took the withered and rolled leaves and passed them through CTC rollers. So the CTC stands for cut, tear, and curl, and you shred the leaf like you would at a paper shredder. And this releases the enzymes and starts the oxidation process. And the leaves look like tightly rolled balls with an increased surface area. And it is this increased surface area that allows the strength of the tea to increase. And the brew is thick and rich and strong and has a wonderful pungent taste and aroma to it. So if you look at the pie chart on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see how CTC is actually 90% of the tea that is produced in India compared to the orthodox leaf tea and the small quantity of green tea. And if you look at the pie chart on the left, you'll see that Assam produces pretty much half the production of India, and a lot of this is CTC, and so does the Duars region, and so does South India. So the 90% of tea production that is CTC comes from these regions. And the orthodox leaf tea and the green teas come from the Darjeeling and the Kangra and the more mountainous areas. Now, India compared to other tea producers, this map shows the different tea producing regions of the world. China has overtaken India by quite a long way. There was a time when India and China produced about the same amount of tea. but China has been running ahead of India for a couple of years now. And if you have a look at these countries, you'll see that even countries like Indonesia and Myanmar and Iran are now producing teas. And I read an interesting story recently about just how the English sent a spy into China to find out how to grow tea. The Prince of Iran actually came into India secretly to learn about how Indians make tea. And then he went back to Iran and started planting tea over there. So the stakes have always been very high for people who want to grow tea. Now, this bar chart shows you the different tea producing countries and how much of their tea is exported and how much is actually drunk within the country. And you'll see that in China and in India, most of the tea that is produced, that's the tea that is in green, is actually consumed within the country. And the exports form a very small amount of their tea production. Whereas in countries like Kenya and Sri Lanka, whatever they produce, they export. So the economies of these different countries are quite different when it comes to tea production and how much they drink at home and how much they export to other countries. And this is a bar chart that shows you where the Indian tea is going in terms of its exports. Russia has always been a very big market for us, and America is growing. Of course, England has also been a good market historically, but other markets like Japan and Egypt are also coming up. So it's quite phenomenal to see the growth of tea from that first chest of tea that was taken to England as part of the dowry of Catherine Braganza. In 1664, 100 pounds of tea was sold in the first London auction. By 1685, it had risen to 12,000 pounds. 5 years later to 38,000 pounds. And then 9 years later, it dropped back to 13,000 pounds, basically because of the illegal smuggling that was happening at that time, as I described earlier. In 1721, it had jumped to 1.2 million pounds of legal imports and 3 million pounds of illegal imports. Then the Boston Tea Party happened, the reduction of the tea tax, and by the end of the century, there were 23 million pounds being brought from China to England for the growing tea market. Now, 100 years later, in 1901, 200 million pounds of tea was planted and produced in India itself. And by the time of independence in 1947, this had jumped to 560 million pounds. And today, global production is well over 11,600 million pounds, which is quite amazing. So looking at the milestones of Indian tea in the early 20th century, as I mentioned, in 1901, 200 million pounds of Indian tea was sent to England. In 1920, and just after the First World War, because the English were anticipating a great demand for tea after the war, there was a boom in prices that caused a huge increase in planting across the empire. And this led to an oversupply of tea. So in 1929, there was a huge collapse in the tea prices. And there was actually a tea agreement, almost a cartel that was set up between the big producers that tried to control the oversupply by limiting what they were producing and selling and limiting the prices. But this didn't really work. And so in the 1930s, the English had to start advertising in India to try and get a new market developed. And that's when tea started being drunk in India. So in 1931, they thought of the first CTC machine based on the feedback from the early Indian tea drinkers. And by 1960, the Indian factories had all incorporated CTC machines as their main method of making tea for the rising popularity for this new type of tea. In 1947, India gained independence from British rule, and in 1950, the Constitution of India was written, and very soon after that, the Plantation Labour Act was formed, and then following that, the Tea Act. So the Plantation Labour Act of 1951 was the first time that workers were legally protected as part of a tea estate community. It also defined what a tea plantation was, stating that it had to be over 30 acres of land and it had to employ 25 or more people. The employer was instructed to provide medical services, education, housing, drinking water, subsidized food grains. and many other benefits. And also work hours, holidays, and overtime were specified. And very importantly, no child labor was allowed. After the formation of India and the new constitution, a lot of changes were made in how the tea estates were governed. And as I mentioned, the Indian Plantation Act protected workers in tea, coffee, rubber, indigo, sugar, and other plantation crops that were grown in India. And also, since colonial powers had left, the British slowly exited tea, and the estates were bought over by Indian companies. So legal protections did cover the workers and ensured that they had access to healthcare, pensions, and gratuities when they retired. Schools were also established, and until the early 1990s, Assam tea really did experience a golden period. Tea was India's largest export, leading to profits for owners and a comparatively good standard of living for the workers and their families. The Tea Act of 1953 was also instituted to protect forest lands and the total area of tea, and the formation of the Tea Board of India was also a significant step in the development of the Indian tea industry. So in 1955, there were 6,840 tea estates in India. And by 1985, this number had jumped up to 13,537. So you can see the huge growth of the tea industry in the second half of the 20th century, mainly from the years 1950 to the 1990s. The land use under tea was significantly increased. And also there was a development of tea clones when a lot of research work was done at the tea research associations in Jorhat and also in South, the UPASI, the United Planters Association of South India, where specific clones were developed to suit the different climatic regions and the conditions of Assam, Darjeeling, and the Nilgiris. These clones brought about higher yields, better pest resistance, and better quality. And you can see from this graph how the yield, which is the kgs produced per hectare, increased during these years. There was also the advent of the Green Revolution in India, which helped the introduction of chemical fertilizers. It gave all crops in India a huge boost where the land was already fertile, and the addition of these nitrogen-based fertilizers like urea allowed them to jump to huge yields in a very short period of time. CTC machines, as I said, were developed to feed the growing demand for these domestic tea drinkers with cheaper teas that were stronger and bolder and fit for making the masala chai that they wanted to drink. The domestic market was growing because the population of India was also steadily growing. So was the economy, and therefore people wanted to drink more tea. There was significant exports of Darjeeling teas and Nilgiri teas going to the UK, to Europe, to Asia, and the Middle East. Darjeeling became world renowned as the champagne of teas, and tea remained the second largest employer within India, with a very well respected industry status. It was only the railways that employed more people than the tea industry. And it was the largest employer of women, and it is still the largest employer of women in the country. And the Tea Workers Union is the largest union in the world. After the 1990s, the formal tea industry started stagnating. No more tea estates were coming up. However, the government opened up lands for small growers and other farmers to convert their land into tea. Tea plants were developed for these small growers, and between 2002 and 2018, the small grower tea production went from about 2 million kgs of tea to 600 million kgs of tea, while the larger estate production remained stagnant at about 800 million kgs of tea. So you can see from this bar graph, the blue bars are the bought leaf production, the pink bars are the large estate production, and the total production is in green. So you can see how in 2000 it was a very small comparison, whereas in 2017 the small growers are pretty much catching up with the larger estates. And so they've made a significant change in the sort of social economic status of, for example, Assam. And while this has been an overall positive change in many ways, this sector does not have to follow any of the laws that the larger estate sector has to. And this has led to various problems as well. Over the years, India has also grown in other sectors. Automobiles and tech is becoming one of the bigger industries today, and opportunities have opened up for skilled management. So the tea industry is no longer the prime industry in the country, although it still remains one of the largest private sector employers. The other problem we've had in the last decade is the stagnation of tea prices, which has changed the whole economic model of a tea estate. So you can see the average prices from 1950 to 2015 and the steady increase that kept up very well with the cost of production. So in 1950, you can see the graph at the very bottom going up to almost 130 rupees per kg in 2017. Whereas if you have a look at the second graph, which starts in 2010 and ends in 2017, you can see how the prices have barely risen from about 140 rupees a kilo up to 200 rupees a kilo. And there's been a significant increase in the cost of production during the same period. So the oversupply of cheap teas in the Indian market has brought down the prices. And the cost of producing the same tea has been going up very steadily. And this has led to a minor crisis in the industry, which we're facing right now. So to summarize some of the things I've been talking about, who is it that comprises the Indian tea industry? On the production side, you have the large estates, you have the small tea growers, and you have the bought leaf factories. The bought leaf factories buy the tea from the small tea growers. Often you'll have middlemen that act as brokers between these two entities, and they are the ones that make the biggest margin. Then you've got the buyers. We have domestic buyers and we have international buyers. And then you have the regulatory bodies, the Workers' Union, the Tea Board of India, and then the regional boards like the United Planters Association of South India, the Darjeeling Tea Association, the Tea Association of India, and the Indian Tea Association. And then you've got the three regional brands, the Assam, the Darjeeling, and the Nilgiri brands that support the specialty teas within India. The challenges faced by the Indian tea industry today are quite formidable, and I'll go through them one by one with some of my thoughts on the current situation. So, talking about climate change, we're seeing heavier rainfall, more intense rain, storms, cyclones, frost in the Nilgiris for the first time, longer periods of drought in regions like Darjeeling. And some of this is also connected with the sort of clones that we're trying to develop. So we have new tea bushes that are more drought resistant or have root systems that deal better with flooding. But these general sort of changes and the rising carbon levels, the rising temperatures all affect photosynthesis, which is so important for the high yields that we need to run our economic models. So, for example, it's 38 degrees in Assam in some months, which never used to happen. In Darjeeling, we're thinking of installing air conditioners in our boutique hotel, which we had never even considered 20 years ago when we set up the hotel. And all these factors do directly affect plant productivity and the yields. Also, with these changes in temperatures, there are more pests and diseases linked to higher temperatures and the changing microclimates. Talking about the increased cost of production, the price of tea is just not keeping up with this cost of production, which has been steadily increasing while the prices of tea has not really changed over the last 5 years. The industry can only be sustainable if the price paid reflects this cost of production. Social costs, medical, retirement funds, bonuses, plus the basic salary, these are all increased costs that are compounded by managing pests and diseases that are linked to climate change and the vicious cycle of bad agricultural practices leading to even more pest and disease problems. The maintenance of housing, infrastructure, schools, hospitals, water, electricity, all of this becomes increasingly difficult as less and less profits are being available for reinvestment. The estates are becoming financially unstable with huge overheads and very low or almost no margins for the teas that they produce. And with new sectors and opportunities opening up, new talent for management is being lost. Nobody is interested in joining the tea sector anymore, and research and technological advancements have happened in other industries, but tea factories haven't really changed much for many years. Then, in terms of the outdated legislature, the Plantation Labor Act was set up at a very different time in India in the 1950s, and it is now severely outdated, even though it was designed to protect the plantation workforce at that time. As per the law, the tea estate owners are bound to provide various facilities for their workers, as we mentioned before, housing, sanitation, subsidized foods, even schools at one point. And health services, not only to the worker, but also to all of his or her dependents. So a job belongs to the worker until he dies or she dies, and then it is passed on to another member of his family. The worker and their families do get these amazing job security benefits and these in-kind benefits like housing. But while it incentivizes a dependency on the estate, with increased mobility of the younger generation and opportunities off the estate to earn extra cash rewards, it's just too tempting for many of them. And often an estate is managing and funding the facilities for thousands of people who do not even contribute to the productive workforce of the plantation. And often the same estate will have a shortage of labor during peak production times in the year. So India is currently in the process of changing its labor laws, and this will impact the tea industry in particular, as 65% of our costs fall into labor costs. And we hope that when wages are debated, the in-kind benefits that we spend are also taken into account by the government. And the new code limits the total in-kind benefits to about 15% of the wages, which is a very high cost for a plantation owner. So the government really does need to take on some of these costs and provisions of infrastructure, as it would do for any of its other citizens. The seasonal nature of the tea industry in North India also needs to be taken into account while framing the new laws and keeping the interest of the stakeholders in mind. And if due to labor shortages, the industry needs to mechanize, like it has already done in South India, which was the first region to suffer from labor shortages, then it will cause an inevitable drop in quality, which will lead to a drop in prices. So there needs to be very careful thought out economic modeling that will link pricing and worker productivity to sustainability in order to help the industry survive the coming years. And it's been interesting during the COVID pandemic to see the terrible plight of migrant labor traveling across the country in their attempt to get home. Whereas on the tea plantations, pretty much all of them have remained COVID-free, and our workers have remained in their safe houses with their subsidized food and their rations, and they haven't really been affected. And it just goes to show how effective the Plantation Act has been in looking after these workers. But this also comes with a cost when the country changes as it has changed. And I'll talk about a little bit more of that in another slide. I'd like to dedicate one whole slide to the small growers sector, as this is a very significant challenge for us that I think we need to look at positively, and I'll talk about that as well. So a small grower is basically a self-employed farmer who has planted tea bushes in a home plot of land. There are no regulations that they need to follow. They have a very low cost of production compared to larger estates who spend huge amounts on infrastructure for their workforce. These farmers sell their leaf to bought leaf factories, but it is really the middleman who makes all the money. So neither the grower nor the factory owner really benefits from this relationship. They have a lack of access to technical know-how, so the techniques for growing tea has not really been passed on to these farmers. So the leaf that they pluck is generally of a lower quality compared to what we would pluck on the larger estates, and keeping the price that they can fetch rather low. And then further planting, pruning, pest management, soil management, all these technical skills are not really sort of accessible for these small growers, and they're not equipped to know how to really maintain their tea bushes to the best of the best particular methods. It's quite difficult to regulate the sector since the small grower sector has grown organically and over the years at a very fast pace. It's been difficult to regulate the agricultural practices that they follow, and they're not part of the Plantation Labor Act, so they're not under the purview of any labor laws that apply to the larger estates. It's also difficult to implement international standards. It's difficult for them to reach markets, get certifications, and match the quality and the standards of the estate sectors. But at the same time, they are producing the same amount of tea that the structured production side of the industry is producing. Now, one of the solutions to this problem is something that our family tea business believes in. We believe that small growers and factories should somehow work together to improve quality, and there will be more money there to be made for each of us. So better tea will fetch better prices, and better quality tea will also mean that less tea will be produced. And this is what is really ailing the industry significantly today. It's the oversupply. And with a focus on better quality, if this leads to a significant drop in supply, it would actually lead to a substantial increase in prices, to the extent that both the growers as well as the factories that often belong to the larger estates will be better off. And for example, this year, when the industry lost about 4 to 6 weeks of production due to the sudden shutdown of the estates with COVID hitting us really badly, just as our first flush season had started in March, everyone has made more money, the small growers as well as the factories and the larger estates, due to the increased demand and the rise in prices. And in many ways, we do hope that this trend will continue. So the future, let's look towards the positive things we can do to face these challenges head on. So starting with climate change, hybrid cultivation could be one of the solutions. We need to look at improving soil conditions, improving yields, and fighting the pest problems. And by hybrid, I mean using integrated pest management solutions. So the use of chemicals comes down, using organic sources of manure to supplement urea and to help rebuild the soil structure, which has been severely destroyed in many tea growing regions due to the constant bad practices that have been applied on these fields over the years, and increasing the biodiversity of each of the tea fields to maintain the balance of pest and disease in a more natural, organic way. And much of this is happening because people are running out of the funds to spend on the chemicals, so they're being forced to go back to organic practices, which is a really amazing thing because that can only help everybody in general. I've already spoken about small tea growers and estates joining hands, and the more we join hands with the sector, the more we can bring everybody onto a level playing field and support each other to raise the quality of the tea that is being produced, which will hopefully level out the oversupply and the undersupply. We've spoken about mechanization and automation, and again, this needs to be continued in the right direction. In South India, it's pretty much 100% mechanical plucking, and with labor shortages and prices increasing, more automation will have to come into the industry, but it must be done in a way to maintain quality and to maintain the prices. Buyers working directly with single estates for higher value teas is something that, again, should be promoted because these buyers will be able to connect with the producers to help produce better margins for them. I've spoken about controlling oversupply and undersupply, as well as the quality versus quantity debate. And then the role of certification, organic, Rainforest Alliance, Trustee, Solidaridad, all these provide standards that bring the producers onto, again, a level playing field where they're bringing a good product to the market and helping the producers to be identified in the international market for this. But certification also has its place, and one should be able to look beyond the certificate by digging deeper into the ethos and sustainable and responsible practices of each estate. An estate like Glenburn, for example, is not organic, but we are rainforest certified. We can't afford some of the more expensive certification, but we have a lot of organic practices. And the biggest compliment that I received many years ago from an ethical tea partnership inspector when we were setting off on our whole certification drive was, he said, you may not have all the fancy signs and the stacks of folders that talk about what you do, but your workers look the happiest that I've ever seen. And we educate 64 children in private schools thanks to our guest support through the Estate Foundation and work with the local government schools to support their school infrastructures with extra teachers, after school libraries, and building repairs. Now, education isn't really something that you'll find on a lot of certification sort of lists of ticks, but it's something that we do. So we always say we go beyond certification, and the best way to certify us is to actually come and visit and see what we're doing for yourselves, rather than relying on that inspector. So delve deeper and really get to know the community that is growing the tea that you are either selling to your clients or buying to drink yourselves. Community development is extremely important because many estates are located in remote areas where there is a very low level of education, and health can be poor even when medical care is available, because there is a strain on resources for a growing population. And the challenge now is how to improve education, nutrition, healthcare, welfare services, sanitation, and housing, all under the growing financial troubles that many of the larger estates are facing due to the low selling prices of tea. And lastly, diversification. For example, tea tourism. The Glenburn model is bringing financial stability to the estate. Many others have also ventured into tea tourism. And recently, we've been allowed to plant alternative crops on 15% of our tea estate land, which has been a big encouraging boost to the future, because this will again help stabilize the economics of the failing tea estates. And my personal advice to end: keep drinking tea. During this lockdown, I have been drinking lots of tea, and it's been now proven to have the most amazing benefits for both immunity and for good health. So get to know where your tea comes from. In today's increasingly connected world, you can easily do this and even virtually visit tea plantations around the world on Zoom sessions and virtual Insta Live programs. Tea is a fascinating product, and as the world begins to actually discover what it has already known for eons, opportunities are out there for tea entrepreneurs as people get more and more educated about fine teas from around the world and different growing regions. It's time you substitute that boring blend for a single malt from Assam or a cup of champagne from Darjeeling. Visit us, visit other estates, and begin this fascinating journey called tea. Thank you.